Welcome all to this evening of Lady Horror Writers. I'm going to start with a story by Mary Shelley. Mary Shelley, born in the 18th century. She was born in 1797 in Somerstown in London. And this story is from 1831 and it's called Transformation. Forthwith this frame of mine was wrenched with woeful agony, which forced me to begin my tale, and then it set me free. Since then, at an uncertain hour, that agony returns, and till my ghastly tale is told, this heart within me burns. Coleridge's Ancient Mariner. I have heard it said that when any strange, supernatural, and necromantic adventure has occurred to a human being, that being, however desirous he may be to conceal the same, feels, at certain periods, torn up, as it were, by an intellectual earthquake, and is forced to bear the inner depths of his spirit to another. I am a witness of the truth of this. I have dearly sworn to myself never to reveal to human ears the horrors to which I once, in excess of fiendly pride, delivered myself over. The holy man who heard my confession and reconciled me to the church is dead. None knows that once. Why should it not be thus? Why tell a tale of impious tempting of providence and soul-subduing humiliation? Why? Answer me, ye who are wise in the secrets of human nature. I only know that so it is, and in spite of strong resolve, of a pride that too much masters me, of shame, and even of fear, so to render myself odious to my species, I must speak. Genoa, my birthplace, proud city, looking upon the blue Mediterranean, dost thou remember me in my boyhood, when thy cliffs and promontories, thy bright sky and gay vineyards were my world? Happy time, when to the young heart the narrow-bounded universe, which leaves by its very limitation free scope to the imagination, enchains our physical energies, and sole period in our lives, innocence and enjoyment are united. Yet who can look back to childhood and not remember its sorrows and its harrowing fears? I was born with the most imperious, haughty, tameless spirit. I quailed before my father only, and he, generous and noble, but capricious and tyrannical, at once fostered and checked the wild impetuosity of my character, making obedience necessary, but inspiring no respect for the motives which guided his commands. To be a man, free, independent, or, in better words, insolent and domineering, was the hope and prayer of my rebel heart. My father had one friend, a wealthy Genoese noble, who, in a political tumult, was suddenly sentenced to banishment and his property confiscated. The Marchese of Torella went into exile alone. Like my father, he was a widower. He had one child, the almost infant Juliet, who was left under my father's guardianship. I should certainly have been unkind to the lovely girl, but that I was forced by my position to become her protector. A variety of childish incidents all tended to one point, to make Juliet see in me a rock of defence. I, in her, one who must perish through the soft sensibility of her nature too rudely visited, but for my guardian care. We grew up together. The opening rose in May was not more sweet than this dear girl, and a radiation of beauty was spread over her face. Her form, her step, her voice. My heart weeps even now to think of all the relying, gentle, loving and pure that she enshrined. When I was 11 and Juliet 8 years of age, a cousin of mine, much older than either, he seemed to us a man, took great notice of my playmate. He called her his bride. Torella rejoiced that my minority would afford an opportunity for repairing my fortunes. Juliet and I had been affianced beside my father's deathbed. Torella was to be a second parent to me. I desired to see the world, and I was indulged. I went to Florence, to Rome, to Naples. Thence I passed to Toulon. There was wild work in Paris then. The poor King Charles VI, now sane, now mad, now a monarch, now an abject slave, was the very mockery of humanity. The Queen, the Dauphin, the Duke of Burgundy, alternately friends and foes, now meeting in prodigal feasts, now shedding blood in rivalry, were blind to the miserable state of their country and the dangers that impended over it, and gave themselves wholly up to dissolute enjoyment or savage strife. My character still followed me. I was arrogant and self-willed. I loved display, and above all, I threw off all control. My young friends were eager to foster passions which furnished them with pleasures. I was deemed handsome. I was master of every knightly accomplishment. I was disconnected with any political party. I grew a favourite with all. My presumption and arrogance were pardoned in one so young. I became a spoiled child. Who could control me? Not the letters and advice of Torella, only strong necessity visiting me in the abhorred shape of an empty purse. But there were means to refill this void. Acre after acre, estate after estate, I sold. My dress, my jewels, my horses, and their caparisons were almost unrivalled in gorgeous Paris, while the lands of my inheritance passed into possession of others. The Duke of Orleans was waylaid and murdered by the Duke of Burgundy. Fear and terror possessed all Paris. The Dauphin and the Queen shut themselves up. Every pleasure was suspended. I grew weary of this state of things, and my heart yearned for my boyhood's haunts. I was nearly a beggar, yet still I would go there, claim my bride, and rebuild my fortunes. A few happy ventures as a merchant would make me rich again. Nevertheless, I would not return in humble guise. My last act was to dispose of my remaining estate near Albaro for half its worth for ready money. Then I dispatched all kinds of artificers, arras, furniture of regal splendour, to fit up the last relic of my inheritance, my palace in Genoa. I lingered a little longer yet, ashamed at the part of the prodigal returned which I feared I should play. I sent my horses. One matchless Spanish jennet I dispatched to my promised bride. Its caparisons flamed with jewels and cloth of gold. In every part I caused to be entwined the initials of Juliet and Herr Guido. My present found favour in hers and her father's eyes. Still, to return a proclaimed spendthrift, the mark of impertinent wonder, perhaps of scorn, and to encounter singly the reproaches or taunts of my fellow citizens, was no alluring prospect. As a shield between me and censure, I invited some of the most reckless of my comrades to accompany me. Thus I went, armed against the world, hiding a rankling feeling, half fear and half penitence, by bravado. I arrived in Genoa. I trod the pavement of my ancestral palace. My proud step was no interpreter of my heart, for I deeply felt that, though surrounded by every luxury, I was a beggar. The first step I took in claiming Juliet must widely declare me such. I read contempt or pity in the looks of all. I fancied that rich and poor, young and old, all regarded me with derision. Torella came not near me. No wonder that my second father should expect a son's deference from me in waiting first on him. But galled and stung by a sense of my follies and demerit, I strove to throw the blame on others. We kept nightly orgies in Palazzo Carrega. To sleepless, riotous nights followed listless, supine mornings. At the Ave Maria we showed our dainty persons in the streets, scoffing at the sober citizens, casting insolent glances on the shrinking women. Juliet was not among them. No, no. If she had been there, shame would have driven me away, if love had not brought me to her feet. I grew tired of this. Suddenly, I paid the Marchesa a visit. He was at his villa, one among the many which decked the suburb of San Pietro da Reina. It was the month of May. The blossoms of the fruit trees were fading among thick green foliage, the vines were shooting forth, the ground strewed with the fallen olive blossoms. The firefly was in the myrtle hedge. Heaven and earth wore a mantle of surpassing beauty. Torella welcomed me kindly, though seriously, and even his shade of displeasure soon wore away. Some resemblance to my father, some look and tone of youthful ingenuousness, softened the good old man's heart. He sent for his daughter. He presented me to her as her betrothed. The chamber became hallowed by a holy light as she entered. Hers was that cherub look, those large, soft eyes, full dimpled cheeks and mouth of infantine sweetness that expresses the rare union of happiness and love. Admiration first possessed me. "She is mine," was the second proud emotion, and my lips curled with haughty triumph. I had not been the enfant gâté of the beauties of France, not to have learnt the art of pleasing the soft heart of woman. If towards men I was overbearing, the deference I paid to them was the more in contrast. I commenced my courtship by the display of 1,000 gallantries to Juliet, who, vowed to me from infancy, had never admitted the devotion of others, and who, though accustomed to expressions of admiration, was uninitiated in the language of lovers. For a few days all went well. Torella never alluded to my extravagance. He treated me as a favourite son. But the time came, as we discussed the preliminaries to my union with his daughter, when this fair face of things should be overcast. A contract had been drawn up in my father's lifetime. I had rendered this, in fact, void by having squandered the whole of the wealth which was to have been shared by Juliet and myself. Torella, in consequence, chose to consider this bond as cancelled and proposed another, in which, though the wealth he bestowed was immeasurably increased, there were so many restrictions as to the mode of spending it, that I, who saw independence only in free career being given to my own imperious will, taunted him as taking advantage of my situation, and refused utterly to subscribe to his conditions. The old man mildly strove to recall me to reason. Roused pride became the tyrant of my thought. I listened with indignation. I repelled him with disdain. "Juliet, thou art mine. Did we not interchange vows in our innocent childhood? Are we not one in the sight of God? And shall thy cold-hearted, cold-blooded father divide us? Be generous, my love. Be just. Take not away a gift, last treasure of thy Guido. Retract not thy vows. Let us defy the world, and setting at naught the calculations of age, find in our mutual affection a refuge from every ill." Fiend I must have been with such sophistry to endeavour to poison that sanctuary of holy thought and tender love. Juliet shrank from me affrighted. Her father was the best and kindest of men, and she strove to show me how, in obeying him, every good would follow. He would receive my tardy submission with warm affection, and generous pardon would follow my repentance. Profitless words for a young and gentle daughter to use to a man accustomed to make his will law, and to feel in his own heart a despot so terrible and stern that he could yield obedience to naught save his own imperious desires. My resentment grew with resistance. My wild companions were ready to add fuel to the flame. We laid a plan to carry off Juliet. At first it appeared to be crowned with success. Midway on our return, we were overtaken by the agonized father and his attendants. A conflict ensued. Before the city guard came to decide the victory in favour of our antagonists, 2 of Torella's servitors were dangerously wounded. This portion of my history weighs most heavily with me. Changed man as I am, I abhor myself in the recollection. May none who hear this tale ever have felt as I. A horse driven to fury by a rider armed with barbed spurs was not more a slave than I to the violent tyranny of my temper. A fiend possessed my soul, irritated it to madness. I felt the voice of conscience within me, but if I yielded to it for a brief interval, it was only to be a moment after torn, as by a whirlwind, away, borne along on the stream of desperate rage, the plaything of the storms engendered by pride. I was imprisoned, and at the instance of Torella, set free. Again I returned to carry off both him and his child to France, which hapless country, then preyed on by freebooters and gangs of lawless soldiery, offered a grateful refuge for a criminal like me. Our plots were discovered. I was sentenced to banishment, and as my debts were already enormous, my remaining property was put in the hands of commissioners for their payment. Torella again offered his mediation, requiring only my promise not to renew my abortive attempts on himself and his daughter. I spurned his offers and fancied that I triumphed when I was thrust out from Genoa, a solitary and penniless exile. My companions were gone. They'd been dismissed to the city some weeks before and were already in France. I was alone, friendless, with neither sword at my side nor ducat in my purse. I wandered along the seashore, a whirlwind of passion possessing and tearing my soul. It was as if a live coal had been set burning in my breast. At first I meditated on what I should do. I would join a band of freebooters. Revenge. The word seemed balm to me. I hugged it, caressed it, till like a serpent it stung me. Then again I would abjure and despise Genoa, that little corner of the world. I would return to Paris, where so many of my friends swarmed, where my services would be eagerly accepted, where I could carve out fortune with my sword and make my paltry birthplace and the false Torella rue the day when they drove me, a new Coriolanus, from her walls. I would return to Paris thus on foot, a beggar, and present myself in my poverty to those I had formerly entertained sumptuously. There was gall in the mere thought of it. The reality of things began to dawn upon my mind, bringing despair in its train. For several months I'd been a prisoner. The evils of my dungeon had whipped my soul to madness, but they had subdued my corporeal frame. I was weak and wan. Torella had used 1,000 artifices to administer to my comfort. I had detected and scorned them all, and I repeated the harvest of my obduracy. What was to be done? Should I crouch before my foe and sue for forgiveness? Die rather 10,000 deaths? Never should they obtain that victory. Hate! I swore eternal hate. Hate from whom? To whom? From a wandering outcast to a mighty noble. I and my feelings were nothing to them. Already had they forgotten one so unworthy. And Juliet, her angel face and sylph-like form gleamed among the clouds of my despair with vain beauty. For I had lost her, the glory and flower of the world. Another will call her his. That smile of paradise will bless another. Even now my heart fails within me when I recur to this rout of grim-visaged ideas. Now subdued almost to tears, now raving in my agony, still I wandered along the rocky shore, which grew at each step wilder and more desolate. Hanging rocks and hoar precipices overlooked the tideless ocean. Black caverns yawned, and forever among the sea-worn recesses murmured and dashed the unfruitful waters. Now my way was almost barred by an abrupt promontory, now rendered nearly impracticable by fragments fallen from the cliff. Evening was at hand, when seaward arose, as if on the waving of a wizard's wand, a murky web of clouds, blotting the late azure sky and darkening and disturbing the till now placid deep. The clouds had strange, fantastic shapes, and they changed and mingled and seemed to be driven about by a mighty spell. The waves raised their white crests. The thunder first muttered, then roared from across the waste of waters, which took a deep purple dye, flecked with foam. The spot where I stood looked on one side to the widespread ocean, on the other it was barred by a rugged promontory. Round this cape, suddenly came, driven by the wind, a vessel. In vain the mariners tried to force a path from her to the open sea. The gale drove her on the rocks. It will perish, all on board will perish. Would I were among them. And to my young heart the idea of death came for the first time blended with that of joy. It was an awful sight to behold that vessel struggling with her fate. Hardly could I discern the sailors, but I heard them. It was all soon over. A rock, just covered by the tossing waves, and so unperceived, lay in wait for its prey. A crash of thunder broke over my head at the moment that, with a frightful shock, the vessel dashed upon her unseen enemy. In a brief space of time she went to pieces. There I stood in safety, and there were my fellow creatures battling, how hopelessly, with annihilation. Methought I saw them struggling. Too truly did I hear their shrieks, conquering the barking surges in their shrill agony. The dark breakers threw hither and thither the fragments of the wreck. Soon it disappeared. I had been fascinated to gaze till the end, At last I sank on my knees. I covered my face with my hands. I again looked up. Something was floating on the billows towards the shore. It neared and neared. Was that a human form? It grew more and more distinct, and at last a mighty wave lifted the whole freight, lodged it upon a rock. A human being bestriding a sea chest, a human being! Yet was it one? Surely never such had existed before, a misshapen dwarf with squinting eyes, distorted features and body deformed, till it became horror to behold. My blood, lately warming towards a fellow being so snatched from watery tomb, froze in my heart. The dwarf got off his chest. He tossed his straight struggling hair from his odious visage.
"By Sir Beelzebub!" he exclaimed. "I have been well bested."
He looked round and saw me.
"Oh, but a fiend, here is another ally of the Mighty One. To what saint did you offer prayers, friend, if not to mine? Yet I remember you not on board."
I shrank from the monster and his blasphemy. Again he questioned me, and I muttered some inaudible reply. He continued,
"Your voice is drowned by this dissonant roar. What a noise the big ocean makes! Schoolboys bursting from their prison are not louder than these waves set free to play. They disturb me. I will no more of their ill-timed brawling. Silence, hoary one! Winds, avaunt! To your homes! Clouds, fly to the antipodes, and leave our heavens clear!"
As he spoke, he stretched out his two long, lank arms that looked like spiders' claws, and seemed to embrace with them the expanse before him. Was it a miracle? The clouds became broken and fled. The azure sky first peeped out, and then was spread a calm field of blue above us. The stormy gale was exchanged to the softly breathing west. The sea grew calm. The waves dwindled to riplets.
"I like obedience, even in these stupid elements," said the dwarf. "How much more on the tameless mind of man? It was a well-got-up storm, you must allow, and all of my own making."
It was tempting Providence to interchange talk with this magician, but power, in all its shapes, is respected by man. Awe, curiosity, a clinging fascination drew me towards him.
"Come, don't be frightened, friend," said the wretch. "I am good-humoured when pleased, and something does please me in your well-proportioned body and handsome face, though you look a little woe-begone. You have suffered a land, I a sea wreck. Perhaps I can allay the tempest of your fortunes as I did my own. Shall we be friends?"
And he held out his hand. I could not touch it.
"Well then, companions, that will do as well. And now, while I rest after the buffeting I underwent just now, tell me why, young and gallant as you seem, you wander thus alone and downcast on this wild seashore?"
The voice of this wretch was screeching and horrid, and his contortions as he spoke were frightful to behold. Yet he did gain a kind of influence over me, which I could not master, and I told him my tale. When it was ended, he laughed long and loud. The rocks echoed back the sound. Hell seemed yelling around me.
"Ho, thou cousin of Lucifer," said he, "so thou too hast fallen through thy pride. And though bright as the sun of morning, thou art ready to give up thy good looks, thy bride, and thy well-being, rather than submit thee to the tyranny of good. I honour thy choice, by my soul. So thou hast fled and yield the day, and mean to starve on these rocks, and to let the birds peck out dead eyes, while thy enemy and thy betrothed rejoice in thy ruin. Thy pride is strangely akin to humility, methinks."
As he spoke, 1,000 fanged thoughts stung me to the heart. "What would you that I should do?" I cried.
"I? Oh, nothing but lie down and say your prayers before you die. But were I you, I know the deed that should be done."
I drew near him. His supernatural powers made him an oracle in my eyes. Yet a strange, unearthly thrill quivered through my frame as I said, "Speak. Teach me. What act do you advise?"
Revenge thyself, man. Humble thine enemies. Set thy foot on the old man's neck and possess thyself of his daughter.
To the east and west I turn, cried I, and see no means. Had I gold, much could I achieve, but poor and single and powerless. The dwarf had been seated on his chest as he listened to my story. Now he got off. He touched a spring. It flew open. What a mine of wealth, of blazing jewels, beaming gold and pale silver, was displayed therein. A mad desire to possess this treasure was born within me. Doubtless, I said, one so powerful as you could do all things.
Nay, said the monster humbly, I'm less omnipotent than I seem. Some things I possess which you may covet, but I would give them all for a small share, or even for a loan of what is yours.
My possessions are at your service, I replied bitterly. My poverty, my exile, my disgrace, I make a free gift of them all.
Good, I thank you. Add one other thing to your gift, and my treasure is yours.
As nothing is my sole inheritance, what besides nothing would you have?
Your comely face and well-made limbs.
I shivered. Would this all-powerful monster murder me? I had no dagger. I forgot to pray, but I grew pale.
I asked for a loan, not a gift, said the frightful thing. Lend me your body for 3 days. You shall have mine to cage your soul, and while, in payment, my chest. What say you to the bargain? 3 short days.
We are told that it's dangerous to hold unlawful talk, and well do I prove the same. Tamely written down, it may seem incredible that I should lend any ear to this proposition, but in spite of his unnatural ugliness, there was something fascinating in a being whose voice could govern earth, air, and sea. I felt a keen desire to comply, for with that chest I could command the worlds. My only hesitation resulted from a fear that he would not be true to his bargain. Then I thought, I shall soon die here on these lonely sands, and the limbs he covets will be mine no more. It's worth the chance. And besides, I knew that by all the rules of art magic, there were formula and oaths which none of its practices dared break. I hesitated to reply, and he went on, now displaying his wealth, now speaking of the petty price he demanded, till it seemed madness to refuse. Thus is it. Place our bark in the current of the stream, and down over fall and cataract it is hurried. Give up our conduct to the wild torrent of passion, and we are away, we know not whither. He swore many an oath, and I adjured him by many a sacred name, till I saw this wonder of power, this ruler of the elements, shiver like an autumn leaf before my words, and as if the spirit spake unwillingly and perforce within him, at last he, with broken voice, revealed the spell whereby he might be obliged, did he wish to play me false, to render up the unlawful spoil. A warm lifeblood must mingle to make and to mar the charm. Enough of this unholy theme. I was persuaded. The thing was done. The morrow dawned upon me as I lay upon the shingles, and I knew not my own shadow as it fell from me. I felt myself changed to a shape of horror, and cursed my easy faith and blind credulity. The chest was there the gold and precious stones for which I had sold the frame of flesh which nature had given me. The sight a little stilled my emotions. 3 days would soon be gone. They did pass. The dwarf had supplied me with a plenteous store of food. At first I could hardly walk, so strange and out of joint were all my limbs, and my voice was that of the fiend. But I kept silent and turned my face to the sun, that I might not see my shadow, and counted the hours and ruminated on my future conduct. To bring Torella to my feet, to possess my Juliet in spite of him, all this my wealth could easily achieve. During dark night I slept, and dreams of the accomplishment of my desires. 2 suns had set. The third dawned. I was agitated, fearful. Oh, expectation, what a frightful thing thou art, when kindled more by fear than hope. How dost thou twist thyself round the heart, torturing its pulsations? How dost thou dart unknown pangs all through our feeble mechanism, now seeming to shiver us like broken glass to nothingness, now giving us fresh strength which can do nothing, and so torments us by a sensation such as the strong man must feel who cannot break his fetters, though they bend in his grasp. Slowly paced the bright, bright orb up the eastern sky. Long it lingered in the zenith, and still more slowly wandered down the west. It touched the horizon's verge. It was lost. Its glories were on the summits of the cliff. They grew dun and grey. The evening star shone bright. He will soon be here. He came not. By the living heavens he came not, and night dragged out its weary length, and in its decaying age day began to grizzle its dark hair, and the sun rose again on the most miserable wretch that ever upbraided its light. 3 days thus I passed, the jewels and the gold, oh how I abhorred them! Well, I will not blacken these pages with demoniac ravings. All too terrible were the thoughts, the raging tumult of ideas that filled my soul. At the end of that time I slept. I had not before since the third sunset, and I dreamed that I was at Juliet's feet, and she smiled, and then she shrieked, for she saw my transformation, and again she smiled, for still her beautiful lover knelt before her. But it was not I. It was he, the fiend, arrayed in my limbs, speaking with my voice, winning her with my looks of love. I strove to warn her, but my tongue refused its office. I strove to tear him from her, but I was rooted to the ground. I awoke with the agony. There were the solitary hoar precipices, there the plashing sea, the quiet strand, and the blue sky over all. What did it mean? Was my dream but a mirror of the truth? Was he wooing and winning my betrothed? I would on the instant back to Genoa, but I was banished. I laughed. The dwarf's yell burst from my lips. I banished? Oh no, they had not exiled the foul limbs I wore. I might with these enter, without fear of incurring the threatened penalty of death, my own native city. I began to walk towards Genoa. I was somewhat accustomed to my distorted limbs. None were ever so ill adapted for a straightforward movement. It was with infinite difficulty that I proceeded. Then, too, I desired to avoid all the hamlets strewed here and there on the sea beach, for I was unwilling to make a display of my hideousness. I was not quite sure that, if seen, the mere boys would not stone me to death as I passed for a monster. Some ungentle salutations I did receive from the few peasants or fishermen I chanced to meet. But it was dark night before I approached Genoa. The weather was so balmy and sweet that it struck me that the Marchese and his daughter would very probably have quitted the city for their country retreat. It was from Villa Torella that I had attempted to carry off Juliet. I had spent many an hour reconnoitring the spot and knew every inch of ground in its vicinity. It was beautifully situated, embosomed in trees on the margin of a stream. As I drew near, it became evident that my conjecture was right. Nay, moreover, that the hours were being then devoted to feasting and merriment, for the house was lighted up. Strains of soft and gay music were wafted towards me by the breeze. My heart sank within me. Such was the generous kindness of Torella's heart that I felt sure that he would not have indulged in public manifestations of rejoicing just after my unfortunate banishment, but for a cause I dared not dwell upon. The country people were all alive and flocking about. It became necessary that I should conceal myself, and yet I longed to address someone, or to hear others discourse, or in any way to gain intelligence of what was really going on. At length, entering the walks that were in immediate vicinity to the mansion, I found one dark enough to veil my excessive frightfulness, and yet others as well as I were loitering in its shade. I soon gathered all that I wanted to know, all that first made my very heart die with horror and then boil with indignation. Tomorrow Juliet was to be given to the penitent, reformed, beloved Guido. Tomorrow my bride was to pledge her vows to a fiend from hell, and I did this! My accursed pride, my demoniac violence and wicked self-idolatry had caused this act. For if I had acted as the wretch who had stolen my form had acted, if with a mien at once yielding and dignified I had presented myself to Torella, saying, I have done wrong, forgive me, I am unworthy of your angel child, but permit me to claim her hereafter, when my altered conduct shall manifest that I abjure my vices, and endeavour to become in some sort worthy of her. I go to serve against the infidels, and when my zeal for religion and my true penitence for the past shall appear to you to cancel my crimes, permit me again to call myself your son. Thus had he spoken, and the penitent was welcomed even as a prodigal son of Scripture. The fatted calf was killed for him, and he, still pursuing the same path, displayed such open-hearted regret for his follies, so humble a concession of all his rights, and so ardent a resolve to reacquire them by a life of contrition and virtue, that he quickly conquered the kind old man, and full pardon and the gift of his lovely child followed in swift succession. Oh, had an angel from paradise whispered to me to act thus! But now what would be the innocent Juliet's fate? Would God permit the foul union, or some prodigy destroying it link the dishonoured name of Corregia with the worst of crimes? Tomorrow at dawn they were to be married. There was but one way to prevent this, to meet mine enemy and to enforce the ratification of our agreement. I felt that this could only be done by mortal struggle. I had no sword, if indeed my distorted arms could wield a soldier's weapon, but I had a dagger, and in that lay my hope. There was no time for pondering or balancing nicely the question. I might die in the attempt, but besides, the burning jealousy and despair of my own heart, honour, mere humanity, demanded that I should fall rather than not destroy the machinations of the fiend. The guests departed. The lights began to disappear. It was evident that the inhabitants of the villa were seeking repose. I hid myself among the trees. The garden grew desert. The gates were closed. I wandered round and came upon a window. Ah, well did I know the same. A soft twilight glimmered in the room. The curtains were half withdrawn. It was the temple of innocence and beauty. Its magnificence was tempered, as it were, by the slight disarrangements occasioned by its being dwelt in, and all the objects scattered around displayed the taste of her who hallowed it by her presence. I saw her enter with a quick, light step. I saw her approach the window. She drew back the curtain yet further and looked out into the night. Its breezy freshness played among her ringlets and wafted them from the transparent marble of her brow. She clasped her hands. She raised her eyes to heaven. I heard her voice. "Guido," she softly murmured. "Mine own Guido." And then, as if overcome by the fullness of her own heart, she sank on her knees. Her upraised eyes, her graceful attitude, the beaming thankfulness that lighted up her face. Oh, these are tame words. Heart of mine, thou imagest ever, thou canst not portray the celestial beauty of that child of light and love. I heard a step, a quick, firm step, along the shady avenue. Soon I saw a cavalier, richly dressed, young, and methought graceful to look on, advance. I hid myself yet closer. The youth approached. He paused beneath the window. She arose, and again looking out, saw him, and said, I cannot know at this distant time, I cannot record her terms of soft silver tenderness. To me they were spoken, but they were replied to by him. I will not go, he cried. Here where you have been, where your memory glides like some heaven-visiting ghost, I will pass the long hours till we meet, never, my Juliet, again, day or night, to part. But do thou, my love, retire. The cold morn and fitful breeze will make thy cheek pale, and fill with languor thy love-lighted eyes. Ah, sweetest, could I press one kiss upon them, I could, methinks, repose. And then he approached still nearer, and methought he was about to clamber into her chamber. I had hesitated, not to terrify her. Now I was no longer master of myself. I rushed forward. I threw myself on him. I tore him away. I cried, "Oh, loathsome and foul-shaped wretch!" I need not repeat epithets, all tending, as it appeared, to rail at a person I at present feel some partiality for. A shriek rose from Juliet's lips. I neither heard nor saw. I felt only mine enemy, whose throat I grasped, and my dagger's hilt. He struggled, but could not escape. At length, hoarsely, he breathed these words: "Do, strike home, destroy this body. You will still live. May your life be long and merry." The descending dagger was arrested at the word, and he, feeling my hold relax, extricated himself and drew his sword, while the uproar in the house and flying of torches from one room to the other showed that soon we should be separated. In the midst of my frenzy there was much calculation. Fall I might, and so that he did not survive, I cared not for the death blow I might deal against myself. While still, therefore, he thought, I paused, and while I saw the villainous resolve to take advantage of my hesitation, in the sudden thrust he made at me, I threw myself on his sword, and at the same moment plunged my dagger with a true, desperate aim in his side. We fell together, rolling over each other, and the tide of blood that flowed from the gaping wound of each mingled on the grass. More I know not. I fainted. Again, I returned to life, weak almost to death. I found myself stretched upon a bed. Juliet was kneeling beside it. Strange, my first broken request was for a mirror. I was so wan and ghastly that my poor girl hesitated, as she told me afterwards. But, by the mass, I thought myself a right proper youth when I saw the clear reflection of my own well-known features. I confess it is a weakness, but I avow to it I do entertain a considerable affection for the countenance and limbs I behold whenever I look at a glass, and have more mirrors in my house and consult them oftener than any beauty in genera. Before you too condemn me, permit me to say that no one better knows than I the value of his own body, no one probably except myself ever having it stolen from them. Incoherently at first talked of the dwarf and his crimes, and reproached Juliet for her too easy admission of his love. She thought me raving, as well she might, and yet it was some time before I could prevail on myself to admit that the Guido whose penitence had won her back for me was myself, and while I cursed bitterly the monstrous dwarf, and blessed the well-directed blow that had deprived him of life, I suddenly checked myself when I heard her say, "Amen," knowing that him whom she reviled was my very self. A little reflection taught me silence. A little practice enabled me to speak of that frightful night without any excessive blunder. The wound I had given myself was no mockery of one. It was long before I recovered, and as the benevolent and generous Torella sat beside me, talking such wisdom as might win friends to repentance, and mine own dear Juliet hovered near me, administering to my wants, and cheering me by her smiles, the work of my bodily cure and mental reform went on together. I have never indeed wholly recovered my strength. My cheek is paler since, my person a little bent. Juliet sometimes ventures to allude bitterly to the malice that caused this change, but I kiss her on the moment and tell her all is for the best. I am a fonder and more faithful husband, and true is this, but for that wound, never had I called her mine. I did not revisit the seashore, nor seek for the fiend's treasure. Yet while I ponder on the past, I often think, and my confessor was not backward in favouring the idea, that it might be a good rather than evil spirit, sent by my guardian angel, to show me the folly and misery of pride. So well at least did I learn this lesson, roughly taught as I was, that I am known now by all my friends and fellow citizens by the name of Guido il Cortese. Gallery review. Oh dear, how much was frozen? Just a couple of seconds, because when I saw it freeze twice, then I paused myself to wait for it to catch up again. Okay, all right, so it's only a couple of moments. So, that was another Mary Shelley. In fact, I didn't check the date, whether that's before or after. I think it must be after Frankenstein was written. Yes. Very, very archaic in its language, that one. Wonderful reading. Thank you, thank you. Oh, thank you. Thank you for all these wonderful compliments. Brilliant. That was wonderful. Thank you so much. Enjoyed that. Great. Good. Well, actually, I have programmed Frankenstein for the 11th of February now. So if you'd like to hear that, I have abridged the book myself so that it is just going to pin myself into the middle. Didn't need to do that. I think I was probably already in the middle for everybody, was I? Well, if anybody can't actually make the show on the evening, they're always recorded, and I'll edit off the chatting, etc. at the ends. And then if anybody wants to buy a ticket, just as usual, then after the show you can send me a mail saying that you didn't attend, and I will send you a private link to YouTube so that you can watch the show over the next few days. Right, I'd like to continue now. Well, I had just a wee sip of water. Yes, in fact, it was Jason, my brother, who's here tonight, Jason Buck, storyteller, who started doing that because occasionally, people will have something else, and so they don't have to miss the show. Then they can just buy the ticket and watch it later. I'm now going to read a story by Charlotte Riddell, born in Carrickfergus in County Antrim in Ireland in 1832. This story was written in 1882. And it's called The Old House in Vauxhall Walk. Just going to pop myself in the middle. Chapter 1. Houseless, homeless, hopeless. Many a one who had before him trodden that same street must have uttered the same words: the weary, the desolate, the hungry, the forsaken, the waifs and strays of struggling humanity that are always and coming and going, cold, starving and miserable, over the pavements of Lambeth parish. But it's open to question whether they were ever previously spoken with a more thorough conviction of their truth, or with a feeling of keener self-pity, than by the young man who hurried along Vauxhall Walk one rainy winter's night, with no overcoat on his shoulders and no hat on his head. A strange sentence for 21 to give expression to, and it was stranger still to come from the lips of a person who looked like and who was a gentleman. He did not appear either to have sunk very far down in the good graces of fortune. There was no sign or token which would have induced a passer-by to imagine he had been worsted after a long fight with calamity. His boots were not worn down at the heels or broken at the toes, as many boots were which dragged and shuffled and scraped along the pavement. His clothes were good and fashionably cut, and innocent of the rents and patches and tatters that slunk wretchedly by, crouched in doorways, and held out a hand mutely appealing for charity. His face was not pinched with famine or lined with wicked wrinkles or brutalised by drink and debauchery, and yet he said and thought he was hopeless, and almost in his young despair spoke the words aloud. It was a bad night to be out and about with such a feeling in one's heart. The rain was cold, pitiless and increasing. A damp, keen wind blew down the cross streets leading from the river. The fumes from the gasworks seemed to fall with the rain. The roadway was muddy, the pavement greasy. The lamps burned dimly, and that dreary district of London looked its very gloomiest and worst. Certainly not an evening to be abroad without a home to go to, or a sixpence in one's pocket. Yet this was the position of the young gentleman who, without a hat, strode along Vauxhall Walk, the rain beating on his unprotected head. Upon the houses, so large and good, once inhabited by well-to-do citizens, now let out for the most part in floors to weekly tenants, he looked enviously. He would have given much to have had a room, or even part of one. He'd been walking for a long time, ever since dark, in fact. Blind dark falls soon in December. He was tired and cold and hungry, and he saw no prospect save of pacing the streets all night. As he passed one of the lamps, the light falling on his face revealed handsome and young features, a mobile, sensitive mouth, and that particular formation of the eyebrows, not a frown exactly, but a certain draw of the brows often considered to bespeak genius, but which more surely accompanies an impulsive organisation, easily pleased, easily depressed, capable of suffering very keenly or of enjoying fully. In his short life he had not enjoyed much, and he had suffered a good deal. That night when he walked bareheaded through the rain, affairs had come to a crisis. So far as he, in his despair, felt able to see or reason, the best thing he could do was to die. The world did not want him. He would be better out of it. The door of one of the houses stood open, and he could see in the dimly lighted hall some few articles of furniture waiting to be removed. A van stood beside the curb, and two men were lifting a table into it as he for a second paused. Ah, he thought, even these poor people have some place to, some go to, some shelter provided, while I have not a roof to cover my head or a shilling to get a night's lodgings. And he went on fast, as if memory were spurring him, so fast that a man running after had some trouble to overtake him. "Master Graham! Master Graham!" this man exclaimed, breathlessly, arid. Thus addressed, the young fellow stopped as if he had been shot. "Who are you that know me?" he asked, facing around. "I'm William. Don't you remember William, Master Graham? And Lord's sake, sir, what are you doing out on a night like this without your hat?" "I forgot it," was the answer, "and I did not care to go back and fetch it." "Oh, why don't you buy another, sir? You'll catch your death of cold. Besides, you'll excuse me, sir, but it does look odd." "I know that," said Master Graham grimly, "but I haven't a halfpenny in the world." "Have you and the master then—" began the man, but there he hesitated and stopped. "Had a quarrel?" "Yes, and one that will last us our lives," finished the other, with a bitter laugh. "Where are you going now?" "Going? Nowhere, except to seek out the softest paving stone or the shelter of an arch." "You're joking, sir." "I don't feel much in a mood for jesting either." "Will you come back with me, Master Graham? We're just at the last of our moving, but there's a spark of fire still in the grate, and it would be better talking out of this rain. Will you come, sir?" "Come, of course I'll come," said the young fellow, and turning, they retraced their steps to the house he had looked into as he passed along. An old house with long, wide hall, stairs low, easy of ascent, with deep cornices to the ceilings and oak floorings and mahogany doors, which still spoke mutely of the wealth and stability of the original owner, who had lived before the Transcendents and the Ashmoles were thought of, and had been sleeping far longer than they in St. Mary's churchyard, hard by the Archbishop's palace. "Step upstairs, sir," entreated the departing tenant. "It's cold down here, with the door standing wide." "Had you the whole house then, William?" asked Graham Coulton in some surprise. "The whole of it. And right sorry I, for one, am to leave it, but nothing else would serve my wife. This room, sir," and with a little conscious pride, William, doing the honours of his late residence, asked his guest into a spacious apartment occupying the full width of the house on the first floor. Tired though he was, the young man could not repress an exclamation of astonishment. "Why, we have nothing so large as this at home, William," he said. "It's a fine house," answered William, raking the embers together as he spoke and throwing some wood upon them. "But like many a good family, it's come down in the world." There were 4 windows in the room, shuttered close. They had deep, low seats, suggestive of pleasant days gone by, when, well curtained and well cushioned, they formed snug retreats for the children, and sometimes for adults also. There was no furniture left, unless an oaken settle beside the hearth, and a large mirror let into the panelling at the opposite end of the apartment, with a black marble console tail beneath it, could be so considered, but the very absence of chairs and tables enabled the magnificent proportions of the chamber to be seen to full advantage. And there was nothing to distract the attention from the ornamented ceiling, the panelled walls, the old-world chimney-piece so quaintly carved, and the fireplace lined with tiles, each one of which contained a picture of some scriptural or allegorical subject. "Had you been staying on here, William," said Coulton, flinging himself wearily on the settle, "I'd have asked you to let me stop where I am for the night." "Well, if you can make shift, sir, there's nothing I'm aware of to prevent you from stopping," answered the man, fanning the wood into a flame. "I shan't take the key back to the landlord till tomorrow, and this would be better for you than the cold streets at any rate." "Do you really mean what you say?" asked the other eagerly. "I should be thankful to lie here. I feel dead beat." "Then stay, Master Graham, and welcome. I'll fetch a basket of coals I was going to put in the van, and make up a good fire so that you can warm yourself. Then I must run round to the other house for a minute or two, but it's not far, and I'll be back as soon as ever I can." "Thank you, William. You always were good to me," said the young man gratefully. "This is delightful." And he stretched his numbed hands over the blazing wood and looked round the room with a satisfied smile. "I did not expect to get into such quarters," he remarked, as his friend in need reappeared, carrying a half-bushel basket full of coals, with which he proceeded to make up a roaring fire. "I'm sure the last thing I could have imagined was meeting with anyone I knew in Vauxhall Walk." "Well, where are you coming from, Master Graham?" asked William curiously. "From old Melfield's. I was at his school once, you know, and he's now retired and is living upon the proceeds of years of robbery in Kennington Oval. I thought perhaps he'd lend me £1 or offer me a night's lodging or even a glass of wine, but, oh dear, no. He took the moral tone and observed he could have nothing to say to a son who defied his father's authority. He gave me plenty of advice, but nothing else, and showed me out into the rain with a bland courtesy for which I could have struck him." William muttered something under his breath which was not a blessing, and added aloud, "You'd better hear, sir, I think, at any rate. I'll be back in less than half an hour." Left to himself, young Coulton took off his coat, and shifting the settle a little, hung it over the end to dry. With his handkerchief he rubbed some of the wet out of his hair, then, perfectly exhausted, he lay down before the fire, and pillowing his head on his arm, fell fast asleep. He was awakened nearly an hour afterwards by the sound of someone gently stirring the fire and moving quietly about the room. Starting into a sitting posture, he looked around him, bewildered for a moment, and then, recognising his humble friend, said laughingly, "I had lost myself. I couldn't imagine where I was." "Sorry to see you here, sir," was the reply. "But still, this is better than being out of doors. It's come on a nasty night. I brought a rug round with me that perhaps you could wrap yourself in." "I wish at the same time you'd brought me something to eat," said the young man, laughing. "Are you hungry then, sir?" said William in a tone of concern. "Yes, I had nothing to eat since breakfast. The governor and I commenced rowing the minute we sat down to luncheon, and I rose and left the table. But hunger does not signify. I'm dry and warm and can forget the other matter in sleep." "Oh, it's too late now to buy anything," soliloquised the man. "Shops are all shut long ago. Do you think, sir," he added, brightening, "you could manage some bread and cheese?" "Do I think? I should call it a perfect feast," answered Graham Coulton. "But never mind about food tonight, William. You've had trouble enough, and to spare, already." William's only answer was to dart to the door and run downstairs. Presently he reappeared, carrying in one hand bread and cheese wrapped in paper, and in the other a pewter measure full of beer. "It's the best I could do, sir," he said apologetically. "I had to beg this from the landlady." "Here's to her good health," exclaimed the young fellow gaily, taking a long pull at the tankard. That tastes better than champagne in my father's house." "Won't he be uneasy about you?" ventured William, who, having by this time emptied the coals, was now seated on the inverted basket, looking wistfully at the relish with which the son of the former master was eating his bread and cheese. "No," was the decided answer. "When he hears it pouring cats and dogs, he will only hope I'm out in the deluge, and say a good drenching will cool my pride." "Don't think you're right there," remarked the man. "Oh, but I'm sure I am. My father always hated me, as he hated my mother." "Begging your pardon, sir, he was over fond of your mother." "If you'd heard what he said about her today, you might find reason to alter your opinion. He told me I resembled her in mind as well as body, that I was a coward, a simpleton, and a hypocrite." "He didn't mean it, sir," Oh, he did, every word. He does think I'm a coward because And the young fellow broke into a passion of hysterical tears. I don't like leaving you here alone, said William, glancing round the room with a quick trouble in his eyes. But I've no place fit to ask you to stop, and I'm forced to go myself because I'm night watchman. I must be on at 12 o'clock. I should be right enough, said the answer. Only I mustn't talk any more of my father. Tell me about yourself, William. How did you manage to get such a big house, and why are you leaving it? Well, the landlord put me in charge, sir, and it was my wife's fancy not to like it. Why did she not like it? She felt desolate alone with the children at night, answered William, turning away his head. Then added next minute, Now, sir, if you think I can do no more for you, I'd best be off. Time's getting on. I'll look round tomorrow morning. Good night, said the young fellow, stretching out his hand, which the other took as freely and frankly as it was offered. What should I have done this evening if I had not chanced to meet you? I don't think there is much chance in the world, Master Graham, was the quiet answer. I do hope you'll rest well, and not be the worse for your wetting. No fear of that, was the rejoinder, and the next minute the young man found himself all alone in the old house in Vauxhall Walk. Chapter 2. Lying on the settle with the fire burnt out and the room in total darkness, Graham Coulton dreamed a curious dream. He thought he awoke from deep slumber to find a log smouldering away upon the hearth and the mirror at the end of the apartment reflecting fitful gleams of light. He could not understand how it came to pass that, far away as he was from the glass, he was able to see everything in it, but he resigned himself to the difficulty without astonishment, as people generally do in dreams. Neither did he feel surprise when he beheld the outline of a female figure seated beside the fire, engaged in picking something out of her lap and dropping it with a despairing gesture. He heard the mellow sound of gold and knew she was lifting and dropping sovereigns. He turned a little so as to see the person engaged in such a singular and meaningless manner, and found that where there had been no chair on the previous night, there was a chair now, on which was seated an old, wrinkled hag, her clothes poor and ragged, a mob cap barely covering her scant white hair, her cheeks sunken, her nose hooked, her fingers more like talons than aught else as they dived down into the heap of gold, portions of which they lifted but to scatter mournfully. "Oh, my lost life," she moaned, in a voice of the bitterest anguish. "Oh, my lost life! For one day, for 1 hour of it again!" Out of the darkness, out of the corner of the room where the shadows lay deepest, out from the gloom abiding near the door, out from the dreary night, with their sodden feet and wet dripping from their heads, came the old men and the young children, the worn women and the weary hearts whose misery that gold might have relieved, but whose wretchedness it mocked. Round that miser who once sat gloating as she now sat lamenting, they crowded, all those pale, sad shapes, the aged of days, the infant of hours, the sobbing outcast, honest poverty, repentant vice. But one low cry proceeded from those pale lips, a cry for help she might have given, but which she withheld. They closed about her all together, as they had done singly in life. They prayed, they sobbed, they entreated. With haggard eyes the figure regarded the poor she had repulsed, the children against whose cries she had closed her ears, the old people she had suffered to starve and die for want of what would have for her been the most merest trifle. Then with a terrible scream she raised her lean arms above her head and sank down, down, the gold scattering as it fell out of her lap and rolling along the floor till its gleam was lost in the outer darkness beyond. Then Graham Coulton awoke in good earnest, with the perspiration oozing from every pore, with a fear and an agony upon him such as he had never before felt in all his existence, and with the sound of the heart-rending cry, "Oh, my lost life," still ringing in his ears. Mingled with all, too, there seemed to have been some lesson for him which he had forgotten, that, try as he would, eluded his memory, and which, in the very act of waking, glided away. He lay there for a little thinking about all this, and then, still heavy with sleep, retraced his way into dreamland once more. It was natural, perhaps, that, mingling with the strange fantasies which follow in the train of night and darkness, the former vision should recur, and the young man ere long found himself toiling through scene after scene wherein the figure of the woman he had seen seated beside a dying fire held principal place. He saw her walking slowly across the floor, munching a dry crust, she who could have purchased all the luxuries wealth can command. On the hearth, contemplating her, stood a man of commanding presence, dressed in the fashion of long ago. In his eyes there was a dark look of anger, on his lips a curling smile of disgust, and somehow, even in his sleep, the dreamer understood it was the ancestor to the descendant he beheld, that the house put to mean use in which he lay had never so far descended from its high estate as the woman possessed of so pitiful a soul, contaminated with the most despicable and insidious vice poor humanity knows, for all other vices seem to have connection with the flesh, but the greed of the miser eats into the very soul. Filthy of person, repulsive to look at, hard of heart as she was, he yet beheld another phantom which, coming into the room, met her almost on the threshold, taking her by the hand and pleading, as it seemed, for assistance. He could not hear all that passed, but a word now and then fell upon his ear. Some talk of former days, some mention of a fair young mother, an appeal, as it seemed, to a time when there were tiny brother and sister, and the accursed greed for gold had not divided them. All in vain. The hag only answered him as she had answered the children, and the young girls, and the old people in his former vision. Her heart was as invulnerable to natural affection as it had proved to human sympathy. He begged, as it appeared, for aid to avert some bitter misfortune or terrible disgrace, and adamant might have been found more yielding to his prayer. Then the figure standing on the hearth changed to an angel, which folded its wings mournfully over its face, and the man with bowed head slowly left the room. Even as he did so, the scene changed again. It was night once more, and the miser wended her way upstairs. From below, Graham Coulton fancied he watched her toiling wearily from step to step. She had aged strangely since the previous scenes. She moved with difficulty. It seemed the greatest exertion for her to creep from step to step, her skinny hand traversing the balusters with slow and painful deliberateness. Fascinated, the young man's eyes followed the progress of that feeble, decrepit woman. She was solitary, in a desolate house with a deeper blackness than the darkness of night waiting to engulf her. It seemed to Graham Coulton that, after that, he lay for a time in a still, dreamless sleep, upon waking from which he found himself entering a chamber as sordid and unclean as it in its appointments as the woman of his previous vision had been in her person. The poorest labourer's wife would have gathered more comforts around her than that room contained. A four-poster bedstead without hangings of any kind, a blind drawn up awry, an old carpet covered with dust and dirt on the floor, a rickety washstand with all the paint worn off it, an ancient mahogany dressing table, and a cracked glass spotted all over, were all the objects he could at first discern, looking at the room through that dim light which oftentimes obtains in dreams. By degrees, however, he perceived the outline of someone lying huddled on the bed. Drawing nearer, he found it was that of the person whose dreadful presence seemed to pervade the house. What a terrible sight she looked, with her thin white locks scattered over the pillow, with what were mere remnants of blankets gathered about her shoulders, with her claw-like fingers clutching the clothes as though, even in sleep, she was guarding her gold. An awful and repulsive spectacle, but not with half the terror in it of that which followed. Even as the young man looked, he heard stealthy footsteps on the stairs. Then he saw first one man and then his fellow steal cautiously into the room. Another second, and the pair stood beside the bed, murder in their eyes. Graham Coulton tried to shout, tried to move, but the deterrent power which exists in dreams only tied his tongue and paralysed his limbs. He could but hear and look, and what he heard and saw was this. Aroused suddenly from sleep, the woman started, only to receive a blow from one of the ruffians, whose fellow followed his lead by plunging a knife into her breast. Then with a gurgling scream, she fell back on the bed, and at the same moment, with a cry, Graham Coulton again awoke, to thank heaven it was but an illusion. Chapter 3. Hope you slept well, sir. It was William who, coming into the hall with the sunlight of a bright morning streaming after him, asked this question. You had a good night's rest? Graham Coulton laughed and answered, Why, faith, I was somewhat in the case of Paddy who could not sleep for dreaming. I slept well enough, I suppose, but whether it was in consequence of the row with my dad, or the hard bed, or the cheese, most likely the bread and cheese so late at night, I dreamt all the night long, the most extraordinary dreams. Some old woman kept cropping up, and I saw her murdered. You don't say that, sir, said William nervously. I do indeed, was the reply. However, that's all gone and past. I've been down in the kitchen and had a good wash. I am as fresh as a daisy and as hungry as a hunter. And, oh, William, can you get me any breakfast? Certainly, Master Graham. I've brought round a kettle and I'll make the water boil immediately. I suppose, sir, this tentatively, you be going home today? Home? Repeated the young man. Decidedly not. I'll never go home again till I return with some medal hung to my coat, or a leg or arm cut off. I've thought it all out, William. I'll go and enlist. There's a talk of war, and living or dead, my father shall have reason to retract his opinion about my being a coward. Oh, I'm sure the Admiral never thought you anything of the sort, sir, said William. Why, you have the pluck of 10. Not before him, answered the young fellow sadly. You'll do nothing rash, Master Graham. You won't go listening or aught of that sort in your anger. If I do not, what is to become of me? Asked the other. I cannot dig. To beg I am ashamed. Why, but for you I should not have had a roof over my head last night. Ah, not much of a roof, I'm afraid, sir. Not much of a roof, repeated the young man. Why, who could desire a better? What a capital room this is, he went on, looking round the apartment, where William was now kindling a fire. One might dine 20 people here, easily. Well, if you think so well of the place, Master Graham, you might stay here for a while, till you made up your mind what you're going to do. The landlord won't make any objection, I'm very sure. Oh, nonsense. He would want a long rent for a house like this. Dare so, if he could get it, was William's significant answer. What do you mean? Won't the place let? No, sir. Didn't tell you last night, but there was a murder done here, and people are shy of the house ever since. A murder? What sort of murder? Who was murdered? A woman, Master Graham, the landlord's sister. She lived here all alone and was supposed to have money. Whether she had or not, she was found dead from a stab in her breast. And if there ever was any money, must have been taken at the same time, for none was found in the house from that day to this. Was that the reason your wife wouldn't stop here? Asked the young man, leaning against the mantel-shelf and looking thoughtfully down on William. Yes, sir. She couldn't stand it any longer. She got that thin and nervous. One wouldn't have believed it possible. She never saw anything, but she said she heard footsteps and voices, and then when she walked through the hall or up the staircase, someone always seemed to be following her. We put the children to sleep in that big room you had last night, and they declared they often saw an old woman sitting by the hearth. Nothing ever came my way, finished William with a laugh. I was always ready to go to sleep the minute my head touched the pillow. Were not the murderers discovered? Said Graham Coulton. No, sir. The landlord, Miss Tynan's brother, had always lain under the suspicion of it, quite wrongfully, I'm very sure, but he'll never clear himself now. It was known he came and asked her for help a day or two before the murder, and it was also known he was able within a week or two to weather whatever trouble had been harassing him. Then, you see, the money was never found, and altogether people scarce know what to think. Ejaculated Graham Coulton, and he took a few turns up and down the apartment. Could I go and see this landlord? Oh, surely, sir, if you had a hat, answered William, with such serious decorum that the young man burst out laughing. That is an obstacle, certainly, he remarked. I must make a note, do, instead. I have a pencil in my pocket, so here goes. Within half an hour from the dispatch of that note, William was back again with a sovereign, the landlord's compliments, and he'll be much obliged if Mr. Coulton could step round. You do nothing rash, sir, entreated William. Why, man, answered the young fellow, one may as well be picked off by a ghost as a bullet. What's there to be afraid of? William only shook his head. He did not think his young master was made of the stuff likely to remain alone in a haunted house and solve the mystery it assuredly contained by dint of his own unassisted endeavours. And yet when Graham Coulton came out of the landlord's house, he looked more bright and gay than usual and walked up the Lambeth Road to the place where William awaited his return, humming an air as he paced along. "We have settled the matter," he said, "and now if the dad wants his son for Christmas, it will trouble him to find him." "Don't say that, Master Graham, don't," entreated the man, with a shiver. "Maybe after all it would have been better if you'd never happened to chance upon Vauxhall Walk." "Don't croak, William," answered the young man. "If it was not the best day's work I ever did for myself, then I'm a Dutchman." During the whole of that forenoon and afternoon, Graham Coulton searched diligently for the missing treasure Mr. Tynan assured him had never been discovered. Youth is confident and self-opinionated, and this fresh explorer felt satisfied that, though others had failed, he would be successful. On the second floor he found one door locked, but he did not pay much attention to that at the moment, as he believed, if there was anything concealed, it was more likely to be found in the lower than the upper part of the house. Later in the evening he pursued his researches in the kitchen and cellars and old-fashioned cupboards, of which the basement had an abundance. It was nearly 11 when, engaged in poking about amongst the empty bins of a wine cellar as large as a family vault, he suddenly felt a rush of cold air at his back. Moving, his candle was instantly extinguished, and in the very moment of being left in darkness, he saw, standing in the doorway, a woman, resembling her who had haunted his dreams overnight. He rushed with outstretched hands to seize her, but clutched only air. He relit the candle and closely examined the basement, shutting off communication with the ground floor ere doing so. All in vain. Not a trace could he find of living creature, not a window was open, not a door unbolted. "It's very odd," he thought as, after securely fastening the door at the top of the staircase, he searched the whole upper portion of the house, with the exception of the one room mentioned. "I must get the key of that tomorrow," he decided, standing gloomily with his back to the fire, and his eyes wandering about the drawing-room, where he had once again taken up his abode. Even as the thought passed through his mind, he saw, standing in the open doorway, a woman with white, dishevelled hair, clad in mean garments, ragged and dirty. She lifted her hand and shook it at him with a menacing gesture, and then, just as he was darting towards her, a wonderful thing occurred. From behind the great mirror there glided a second female figure, at the sight of which the first turned and fled, uttering piercing shrieks as the other followed her from story to story. Sick almost with terror, Graham Coulton watched the dreadful pair as they fled upstairs, past the locked room to the top of the house. It was a few minutes before he recovered his self-possession. When he did so, and searched the upper apartments, he found them totally empty. That night, ere lying down before the fire, he carefully locked and bolted the drawing-room door. Before he did more, he drew the heavy settle in front of it, so that if the lock were forced, no entrance could be effected without considerable noise. For some time he lay awake, then dropped into a deep sleep, from which he was awakened suddenly by a noise as if of something scuffling stealthily behind the wainscot. He raised himself on his elbow and listened, and to his consternation beheld, seated on the opposite side of the hearth, the same woman he had seen before in his dream, lamenting over her gold. The fire was not quite out, and at that moment shot up a last tongue of flame. By the light, transient as it was, he saw that the figure pressed a ghostly finger to its lips, and by the turn of its head and the attitude of its body, seemed to be listening. He listened also. Indeed, he was too much frightened to do aught else. More and more distinct grew the sounds which had aroused him, a stealthy rustling coming nearer and nearer, up and up it seemed, behind the wainscot. "It's rats," thought the young man, though indeed his teeth were almost chattering in his head with fear. But then in a moment he saw what disabused him of that idea, the gleam of a candle or lamp through a crack in the panelling. He tried to rise. He strove to shout, all in vain, and sinking down, remembered nothing more till he awoke to find the grey light of an early morning stealing through one of the shutters he had left partially unclosed. For hours after his breakfast, which he scarcely touched, long after William had left him at midday, Graham Coulton, having in the morning made a long and close survey of the house, sat thinking before the fire. Then, apparently, having made up his mind, he put on the hat he had bought and went out. When he returned, the evening shadows were darkening down, but the pavements were full of people going marketing, for it was Christmas Eve, and all who had money to spend seemed bent on shopping. It was terribly dreary inside the old house that night. Through the deserted rooms, Graham could feel that ghostly semblance was wandering mournfully. When he turned his back, he knew she was flitting from the mirror to the fire, from the fire to the mirror. But he was not afraid of her now. He was far more afraid of another matter he had taken in hand that day. The horror of the silent house grew and grew upon him. He could hear the beating of his own heart in the dead quietude which reigned from garret to cellar. At last William came, but the young man said nothing to him of what was in his mind. He talked to him cheerfully and hopefully enough, wondered where his father would think he had got to, and hoped Mr. Tynan might send him some Christmas pudding. Then the man said it was time for him to go, and when Mr. Coulton went downstairs to the hall door, remarked the key was not in it. "Oh, no," was the answer. "I took it out today to oil it." "Oh, wanted oiling," agreed William, for it was terribly stiff. Having uttered which truism, he departed. Very slowly the young man retraced his way to the drawing-room, where he only paused to lock the door on the outside. Then, taking off his boots, he went up to the top of the house, where, entering the front attic, he waited patiently in the darkness and in silence. It was a long time, or at least it seemed long to him, before he heard the same sound which had aroused him on the previous night, a stealthy rustling, then a rush of cold air, then cautious footsteps, then the quiet opening of a door below. It did not take as long in action as it is required to tell. In a moment the young man was out on the landing and had closed a portion of the panelling on the wall which stood open. Noiselessly he crept back to the attic window, unlatched it, and sprung a rattle, the sound of which echoed far and near through the deserted streets. Then, rushing down the stairs, he encountered a man who, darting past him, made for the landing above, but perceiving the way of escape closed, fled down again to find Graham struggling desperately with his fellow. "Give him the knife! Come along!" he said savagely, and next instant Graham felt something like a hot iron through his shoulder, and then he heard a thud as one of the men, tripping in his rapid flight, fell from the top of the stairs to the bottom. At the same moment there came a crash, as if the house was falling, and faint, sick and bleeding, young Coulton lay insensible on the threshold of the room where Miss Tyson had been murdered. When he recovered, he was in the dining room, and a doctor was examining his wound. Near the door, a policeman stiffly kept guard. The hall was full of people. All the misery and vagabondism the street contained at that hour was crowded in to see what had happened. Through the midst, 2 men were being conveyed to the station house. One, with his head dreadfully injured, on a stretcher, the other handcuffed, uttering frightful imprecations as he went. After a time the house was cleared of the rabble. The police took possession of it, and Mr. Tynan was sent for. "What was that terrible noise?" asked Graham feebly, now seated on the floor with his back resting against the wall. "I do not know. Was there a noise?" asked Mr. Tynan, humouring his fancy as he thought. "Yes, in the drawing-room, I think. The key's in my pocket." Still humouring the wounded, Mr. Tynan took the key and ran upstairs. When he unlocked the door, what a sight met his eyes! The mirror had fallen. It was lying all over the floor, shivered into 1,000 pieces. The console table had been borne down by its weight, and the marble slab was shattered as well. But this was not what chained his attention. Hundreds, thousands of gold pieces were scattered about, and an aperture behind the glass contained boxes filled with securities amid deeds, amid bonds, the possession of which had cost his sister her life. Well, Graham, what do you want? Asked Admiral Coulton that evening as his eldest son appeared before him, looking somewhat pale but otherwise unchanged. I want nothing, was the answer, but to ask your forgiveness. William has told me all the story I knew before, and if you let me, I'll try to make it up to you for the trouble you've had. I'm provided for, went on the young fellow with a nervous laugh. I've made my fortune since I left you, and another man's fortune as well. I think you're out of your senses, said the Admiral shortly. No, sir, I found them, was the answer. And I mean to strive and make a better thing of my life than I should ever have done had I not gone to the old house in Vauxhall Walk. Vauxhall Walk? What's the lad talking about? I will tell you, sir, if I may sit down, was Graham Coulton's answer. And then he told his story. Thank you. Spooky ghosty here. So, spend your money on other people now before it's too late. I'm terrified. Great story. Well, I'm glad you all liked it. It's been really fun digging through loads of material from the 19th century to find lesser known stories. I don't know how many of you already knew Charlotte Riddell as a writer, but I'll definitely be exploring her writings more after this. Bravo, thank you. Oh, a wonderful storyteller. Oh, thank you. I was enthralled. Move the chat over to the side so I can actually read it. I didn't know Charlotte Riddell and read to Chris Riddell. Jimmy Riddell, I think, probably. Well, I'm glad you all liked that. Completely absorbing. Good. That's the idea. Forget everything else. Oops, illustrator. What, another Riddell, is that, Ziggy? Oh, Chris Riddell's an illustrator, okay. Or Jimmy Riddell was a bit of a rude reference there. Riddell. Spooky, atmospheric and fabulously told. Thank you. Look at the comment from Anne Valentine. I shall have a look at all the comments in a second. Let me see if I can. I wanted to buy a ticket for last Friday's performance, but it clashed with another online reading. Oh, yes, you can. I'll catch up with you at the end to let you know how to do that. Yeah, I mean, if you just pay for a ticket through PayPal, I guess, and I'll send you the details, then I'll send you a private link to YouTube so you can watch last week's story. Oh, Ziggy, you've put my hearse up. I thought it was lovely. Oh, the hearses these days seem to be grey and silver and sort of trying not to stick out. I mean, hearses were wonderful vehicles. A friend of mine, when I lived in Camden Town, bought, but then very quickly sold, unfortunately. But I did get one ride in it to the pub. A lovely old hearse with engraved windows and everything. It was beautiful. But this one was from Germany. That one that's well, I posted it in the. I don't know if I'll just add spotlight. There you can see wonderful horse-drawn hearse there. That's what I want, and I want to be just propped up on the front till they get to the crematorium. Right, remove all spotlights. Speaker view. Should be speaker. That should be me. Gallery view. I'll just pin myself. Spotlight for everyone. There we go. And our next author tonight, I think probably all of us know as a children's author. She wrote The Railway Children, 5 Children in It, The Phoenix and the Carpet, and various other wonderful children's books. But she was, in her day, an extremely prolific writer of horror and ghost stories for adults. Edith Nesbit, or E. Nesbit as we generally call her, who was born in Kennington in 1858. The story was written in 1893 and it's called The Mystery of the Sem-Detached. He was waiting for her. He'd been waiting an hour and a half in a dusty suburban lane with a row of big elms on one side and some eligible building sites on the other, and far away to the southwest, the twinkling yellow lights of the Crystal Palace. It was not quite like a country lane, for it had a pavement and lamp posts, but it was not a bad place for a meeting all the same, and farther up towards the cemetery it was really quite rural and almost pretty, especially in twilight. But twilight had long deepened into night, and still he waited. He loved her, and he was engaged to be married to her, with the complete disapproval of every reasonable person who had been consulted. And this half-clandestine meeting was tonight to take the place of the grudgingly sanctioned weekly interview, because a certain rich uncle was visiting at her house, and her mother was not the woman to acknowledge to a moneyed uncle, who might go off any day, a match so deeply ineligible as hers with him. So he waited for her, and the chill of an unusually severe May evening entered into his bones. The policeman passed him with but a surly response to his "good night." The bicyclists went by him like grey ghosts with foghorns, and it was nearly 10 o'clock, and she had not come. He shrugged his shoulders and turned towards his lodgings. His road led him by her house, desirable, commodious, semi-detached, and he walked slowly as he neared it. She might even now be coming out, but she was not. There was no sign of movement about the house, no sign of life, no lights even in the windows, and her people were not early people. He paused by the gate, wondering. Then he noticed that the front door was open, wide open, and the street lamp shone a little way into the dark hall. There was something about all this that did not please him, that scared him a little indeed. The house had a gloomy and deserted air. It was obviously impossible that it harboured a rich uncle. The old man must have left early, in which case he walked up the path of patent glazed tiles and listened. No sign of life. He passed into the hall. There was no light anywhere. Where was everybody? Why was the front door open? There was no one in the drawing room. The dining room and the study, 9 feet by 7, were equally blank. Everyone was out, evidently, but the unpleasant sense that he was perhaps not the first casual visitor to walk through that open door impelled him to look through the house before he went away and closed it after him. So he went upstairs, and at the door of the first bedroom he came to, he struck a wax match, as he had done in the sitting rooms. Even as he did so, he felt that he was not alone, and he was prepared to see something, but for what he saw he was not prepared. For what he saw lay on the bed in a white, loose gown, and it was his sweetheart, and its throat was cut from ear to ear. He doesn't know what happened then, nor how he got downstairs and into the street, but he got out somehow, and the policeman found him in a fit under the lamp-post at the corner of the street. He couldn't speak when they picked him up, and he passed the night in the police cells because the policeman had seen plenty of drunken men before, but never one in a fit. The next morning he was better, though still very white and shaky. But the tale he told the magistrate was convincing, and they sent a couple of constables with him to her house. There was no crowd about it, as he had fancied there would be, and the blinds were not down. As he stood dazed in front of the door, it opened, and she came out. He held on to the doorpost for support. "She's all right, see," said the constable, who had found him under the lamp. "I told you was drunk, but you would know best." When he was alone with her, he told her not all, for that would not bear telling. at how he had come into the commodious semi-detached, and how he had found the door open and the lights out, and that he had been into that long back room facing the stairs, and had seen something, and even trying to hint at which, he turned sick and broke down and had to have brandy given him. "But my dearest," she said, "I dare say the house was dark, for we were all at the Crystal Palace with my uncle, and no doubt the door was open, for the maids will run out if they're left. But you could not have been in that room, because I locked it when I came away and the key was in my pocket. I dressed in a hurry and I left all my odds and ends lying about." "I know," he said. "I saw a green scarf on a chair and some long brown gloves and a lot of hairpins and ribbons and a prayer book and a lace handkerchief on the dressing table. Why, I even noticed the almanac on the mantelpiece, October 21. At least it couldn't be that, because this is May. Yet it was. Your almanac is at October 21, isn't it?" "Of course it isn't," she said, smiling rather anxiously. "But all the other things were just as you say. You must have had a dream or a vision or something." He was a very ordinary, commonplace, city young man, and he didn't believe in visions. But he never rested day or night till he got his sweetheart and her mother away from that commodious semi-detached and settled them in a quiet, distant suburb. In the course of the removal, he accidentally married her, and the mother went on living with them. His nerves must have been a good bit shaken, because he was very queer for a long time and was always inquiring if anyone had taken the desirable semi-detached. And when an old stockbroker with a family took it, he went the length of calling on the old gentleman and imploring on him by all that he held dear not to live in that fateful house. "Why?" said the stockbroker, not unnaturally. And then he got so vague and confused between trying to tell why and trying not to tell why, that the stockbroker showed him out and thanked his God he was not such a fool as to allow a lunatic to stand in the way of his taking that really remarkably cheap and desirable semi-detached residence. Now, the curious and quite inexplicable part of this story is that when she came down to breakfast on the morning of the 22nd of October, she found him looking like death, with a morning paper in his hand. He caught hers. He couldn't speak, and pointed to the paper. And there she read that, on the night of the 21st, a young lady, the stockbroker's daughter, had been found with her throat cut from ear to ear, on the bed in the long back bedroom facing the stairs of that desirable semi-detached. There. Desirable semi-detached. If it's cheap, you know why. Whoop. Yes, that poor lass. Throat cut from ear to ear. Good, nicely told. Thank you. Well, the first two stories were quite long, and that was a short one. Loved it. Yes, I do like the desirable semi-detached. That was what kind of drew me to the story. But I was very surprised to find E. Nesbit writing this kind of thing, so we will be having more of this, quite definitely. So if we're all ready for the last piece I'm going to read, I'm going to read you a horror poem by Christina Rossetti, whom a lot of you will know as a very well-known poet, sister, not wife, as I said last week, which was a terrible gaffe, of the Pre-Raphaelite painter Dante Gabriel Rossetti, who was born in Charlotte Street in Marylebone, which is now Hallam Street, in 1830. And this story is from 1862, this poem, and it's called Goblin Market. Why am I can't see myself? Spotlight for everyone. Goblin Market. Morning and evening maids heard the goblins cry,
Come buy our orchard fruits, come buy. Apples and quinces, lemons and oranges, plump unpecked cherries, melons and raspberries, bloom-down-cheeked peaches, swart-headed mulberries, wild free-born cranberries, crab-apples, dewberries, pineapples, blackberries, apricots, strawberries, all ripe together in summer weather. Morns that pass by, fair eves that fly, come buy, come buy. Our grapes fresh from the vine, pomegranates full and fine, dates and sharp bullaces, rare pears and greengages, damsons and bilberries, taste them and try, currants and gooseberries, bright fire-like barberries, figs to fill your mouth, citrons from the south, sweet to tongue and sound to eye, come buy, come buy.
Evening by evening, among the brookside rushes, Laura bowed her head to hear, Lizzie veiled her blushes. Crouching close together in the cooling weather, with clasping arms and cautioning lips, with tingling cheeks and fingertips, "Lie close," Laura said, pricking up her golden head. "We must not look at goblin men, we must not buy their fruits. Who knows upon what soil they fed their hungry, thirsty roots?"
"Come buy," called the goblins, hobbling down the glen.
"Oh," cried Lizzie, "Laura, Laura, you should not peep at goblin men." Lizzie covered up her eyes, covered close lest they should look. Laura reared her glossy head and whispered like the restless brook, look, Lizzie, down the glen tramp little men. One hauls a basket, one bears a plate, one lugs a golden dish of many pounds weight. How fair the vine must grow, whose grapes are so luscious, how warm the wind must blow through those fruit bushes." "No," said Lizzie, no. Their offers should not charm us, their evil gifts would harm us. She thrust a dimpled finger in each ear, shut eyes and ran. Curious Laura chose to linger, wondering at each merchant man. One had a cat's face, one whisked a tail, one tramped at a rat's pace, one crawled like a snail. One like a wombat prowled, obtuse and furry, one like a rattle tumbled hurry-scurry. She heard a voice like voice of doves cooing all together. They sounded kind and full of loves in the pleasant weather. Laura stretched her gleaming neck like a rush-embedded swan, like a lily from the beck, like a moonlit poplar branch, like a vessel at the launch when its last restraint is gone. Backwards up the mossy glen turned and trooped the goblin men with their shrill repeated cry, "Come buy, come buy." When they reached where Laura was, they stood stock still upon the moss, leering at each other, brother with queer brother, signalling each other, brother with sly brother. One set his basket down, one reared his plate, one began to weave a crown of tendrils, leaves, and rough nuts brown. Men sell not such in any town. One heaved the golden weight of dish and fruit to offer her. "Come buy, was still their cry. Laura stared but did not stir, longed but had no money. The whisk-tailed merchant bade her taste in tones as smooth as honey. The cat-face purred, the rat-face spoke a word of welcome, and the snail-pace even was heard. One parrot-voiced and jolly cried, "Pretty goblin," still for pretty Polly. One whistled like a bird. But sweet-toothed Laura spoke in haste. "Good folk, I have no coin to take were to purloin. I have no copper in my purse, I have no silver either, and all my gold is on the furze that shakes in windy weather above the rusty heather."
"You have such gold upon your head," they answered all together. "Buy from us with the golden curl."
She clipped a precious golden lock. She dropped a tear more rare than pearl, then sucked their fruit globes, fair or red, sweeter than honey from the rock, stronger than man-rejoicing wine, clearer than water flowed that juice. She never tasted such before. How should it cloy with length of use? She sucked and sucked and sucked the more, fruits which that unknown orchard bore. She sucked until her lips were sore, then flung the emptied rinds away, but gathered up one kernel stone, and knew not was it night or day, as she turned home alone. Lizzie met her at the gate, full of wise upbraidings. "Dear, you should not stay so late. Twilight is not good for maidens. Should not loiter in the glen, in the haunts of goblin men. Do you not remember Jeanie? How she met them in the moonlight, took their gifts, both choice and many, ate their fruits and wore their flowers, plucked from bowers where summer ripens at all hours. But ever in the noonlight she pined and pined away, sought them by night and day, found them no more, but dwindled and grew grey, then fell with the first snow, while to this day no grass will grow where she lies low. I planted daisies there a year ago that never blow. You should not loiter so." "Nay, hush," said Laura. "No, hush, my sister. I ate and ate my fill, yet my mouth waters still. To-morrow night I will buy more," and kissed her. "Have done with sorrow. I'll bring you plums to-morrow, fresh on their mother's twigs, cherries worth the getting. You cannot think what figs my teeth have met in, what melons icy cold, piled on a dish of gold, too huge for me to hold, what peaches with a velvet nap, pellucid grapes without one seed. Odorous indeed must be the mead whereon they grow, and pure the wave they drink, with lilies at the brink, and sugar sweet their sap. Golden head by golden head, like two pigeons in one nest, folded in each other's wings, they lay down in their curtained bed, like two blossoms on one stem, like two flakes of new-fallen snow, like two wands of ivory tipped with gold for awful kings. Moons and stars gazed in at them, wind sang them a lullaby, lumbering owls forbore to fly, not a bat flapped to and fro round their rest, cheek to cheek and breast to breast, locked together in one nest. Early in the morning, when the first cock crowed his warning, neat like bees, as sweet and busy, Laura rose with Lizzie, fetched in honey, milked the cows, aired and set to rights the house, kneaded cakes of whitest wheat, cakes for dainty mouths to eat. Next churned butter, whipped up cream, fed their poultry, sat and sewed, talked as modest maidens should. Lizzie with an open heart, Laura in an absent dream, one content, one sick in part, one warbling for the mere bright day's delight, one longing for the night. At length slow evening came. They went with pitchers to the reedy brook, Lizzie most placid in her look, Laura most like a leaping flame. They drew the gurgling water from its deep, Lizzie plucked purple and rich golden flags, then turning homeward said, "The sunset flushes those furthest loftiest crags. Come, Laura, not another maiden lags. No wilful squirrel wags, the beasts and birds are fast asleep." But Laura loitered still among the rushes, and said the bank was steep, and said the hour was early still, and dew not fall and the wind not chill, listening ever, but not catching the customary cry,
"Come by, come by,"
with this iterated jingle of sugar-baited words. Not for all her watching, once discerning even one goblin, racing, whisking, tubbling, hobbling, let alone the herd that used to tramp along the glen in groups or single, of brisk fruit merchant men. Till Lizzie urged, "Oh, Laura, come, I hear the fruit call, but I dare not look. You should not loiter any longer at this brook. Come with me home. The stars rise, the moon bends her arc, each glowworm winks her spark. Let us get home before the night grows dark, for clouds may gather, though this is summer weather, put out the lights and drench us through, then if we lost our way, what should we do?" Laura turned cold as stone to find her sister heard that cry alone, that goblin cry,
"Come buy our fruits, come buy."
Must she then buy no more such dainty fruit? Must she no more such succous pasture find, gone deaf and blind? Her tree of life drooped from the root. She said not one word of her heart's sore ache, but peering through the dimness, naught discerning, trudged home, her pitcher dripping all the way, so crept to bed and lay silent till Lizzie slept, then sat up in a passionate yearning and gnashed her teeth for balked desire and wept as if her heart would break. Day after day, night after night, Laura kept watching vain, in sullen silence of exceeding pain. She never caught again the goblin cry,
"Come buy, come buy."
She never spied the goblin men hawking their fruits along the glen. But when the noon waxed bright, her hair grew thin and grey, She dwindle as the fair full moon doth turn to swift decay and burn her fire away. One day, remembering her kernel stone, she set it by a wall that faced the south, dewed it with tears, hoped for a root, watched for a waxing shoot, but there came none. It never saw the sun, it never felt the trickling moisture run. While with sunk eyes and faded mouth she dreamed of melons, as a traveller sees false waves in desert drouth, with shade of leaved crowned trees, and burns the thirstier in the sandful breeze. She no more swept the house, tended the fowls or cows, fetched honey, kneaded cakes of wheat, brought water from the brook, but sat down listless in the chimney nook, and would not eat. Tender Lizzie could not bear to watch her sister's cankerous care, yet not to share. She night and morning caught the goblin's cry, "Come buy our orchard fruits, come buy, come buy." Beside the brook, along the glen, she heard the tramp of goblin men. The voice and stir poor Laura could not hear. Longed to buy fruit to comfort her, but fees paid too dear. She thought of Jeanie in her grave, who should have been a bride, but who for joy's brides hoped to have, fell sick and died in her gay prime, in earliest winter time, with the first glazing rime, with the first snowfall of crisp winter time. To Laura, dwindling, seemed knocking at death's door. Then Lizzie weighed no more better and worse, but put a silver penny in her purse, kissed Laura, crossed the heath with clumps of furze, at twilight halted by the brook, and for the first time in her life began to listen and to look. Laughed every goblin when they spied her peeping, came towards her hobbling, flying, running, leaping, puffing and blowing, chuckling, clapping, crowing, clucking and gobbling, mopping and mowing, full of airs and graces, pulling wry faces, demure grimaces, cat-like and rat-like, rattle and wombat-like, snail-paced in a hurry, parrot-voiced and whistler, helter-skelter, hurry-scurry, chattering like magpies, fluttering like pigeons, gliding like fishes, hugged her and kissed her, squeezed and caressed her, stretched up their dishes, panniers and plates. Look at our apples, russet and dun, bob at our cherries, bite at our peaches, citrons and dates, grapes for the asking, pears red with basking out in the sun, plums on their twigs, pluck them and suck them, pomegranates, figs. Good folk, said Lizzie, mindful of Jeanie, give me much and many. Held out her apron, tossed them her penny. Nay, take a seat with us, honour and eat with us, they answered, grinning. Our feast is but beginning. Night yet is early, warm and dew-pearly, wakeful and starry. Such fruits as these no man can carry, half their bloom would fly, half their dew would dry, half their flavour would pass by. Sit down and feast with us. Be welcome guest with us. Cheer you and rest with us. Thank you, said Lizzie, but one waits at home alone for me. So without further piling, if you will not sell me any of your fruits, though much and many, give me back my silver penny. I tossed you for a fee. They began to scratch their pates, no longer wagging, purring, but visibly demurring, grunting and snarling. One called her proud, cross-grained, uncivil. Their tones waxed loud, their looks were evil. Lashing their tails, they trod and hustled her, elbowed and jostled her, clawed with their nails, barking, mewing, hissing, mocking, tore her gown and soiled her stocking, twitched her hair out by the roots, stamped upon her tender feet, held her hands and squeezed their fruits against her mouth to make her eat. White and golden Lizzie stood, like a lily in a flood, like a rock of blue-veined stone, lashed by tides obstreperously, like a beacon left alone in a hoary, roaring sea, sending up a golden fire, like a fruit-crowned orange tree, white with blossoms honey-sweet, sore beset by wasp and bee, like a royal virgin town, topped with gilded dome and spire, close beleaguered by a fleet mad to tear her standard down. One may lead a horse to water, 20 cannot make him drink. Though the goblins cuffed and caught her, coaxed and fought her, bullied and besought her, scratched her, pinched her black as ink, kicked her and knocked her, mauled and mocked her. Lizzie uttered not a word, would not open lip from lip, lest they should cram a mouthful in, but laughed in heart to feel the drip of juice that syrupped all her face, and lodged in dimples of her chin, and streaked her neck, which quaked like curd. At last the evil people, worn out by her resistance, flung back her penny, kicked their fruit along whichever road they took, not leaving root or stone or shoot. Some writhed into the ground, some dived into the brook, with ring and ripple, some scudded on the gale without a sound, some vanished in the distance. In a smart ache tingle, Lizzie went her way, knew not was it night or day, sprang up the bank, though, through the furze, threaded copse and dingle, and heard her penny jingle bouncing in her purse. Its bounce was music to her ear. She ran and ran, as if she feared some goblin man dogged her with jibe or curse or something worse. But not one goblin scurried after, nor was she pricked by fear. The kind heart made her windy pace that urged her home, quite out of breath with haste and inward laughter. She cried, "Laura!" up the garden. "Did you miss me? Come and kiss me. Never mind my bruises, hug me, kiss me, suck my juices, squeezed from goblin fruits for you, goblin pulp and goblin dew. Eat me, drink me, love me, Laura, make much of me. For your sake I have braved the glen and had to do with goblin merchant men." Laura started from her chair, flung her arms up in the air, clutched her hair. "Lizzie, Lizzie, have you tasted for my sake the fruit forbidden? Must your light like mine be hidden? Your young life like mine be wasted, undone in my undoing, and ruined in my ruin? Thirsty, cankered, goblin-ridden." She clung about her sister, kissed and kissed and kissed her. Tears once again refreshed her shrunken eyes, dropping like rain after long sultry drouth. Shaking with anguish, fear and pain, she kissed and kissed her with a hungry mouth. Her lips began to scorch. That juice was wormwood to her tongue. She loathed the feast. Living as one possessed, she leapt and sung, rent all her robe and wrung her hands in lamentable haste, and beat her breast. Her locks streamed like the torch borne by a racer at full speed, or like the mane of horses in their flight, or like an eagle when she stems the light straight towards the sun, or like a caged thing freed, or like a flying flag when armies run. Swift fire spread through her veins, knocked at her heart, made the fire smouldering there, and overbore its lesser flame. She gorged on bitterness without a name, and oh, fool to choose such a part of soul-consuming care. Sense failed in the mortal strife, like the watchtower of a town with which an earthquake shatters down, like a lightning-stricken mast, like a wind-uprooted tree spun about, like a foam-topped waterspout cast down headlong in the sea. She fell at last. Pleasure past, and anguish past. Is it death, or is it life? Life out of death. That night long Lizzie watched by her, counted her pulses' flagging stir, felt for her breath, held water to her lips and cooled her face with tears and fanning leaves. But when the first birds chirped about their eaves, and early reapers plodded to the place of golden sheaves, and dew-wet grass bowed in the morning winds so brisk to pass, and new buds with new day opened cup-like lilies on the stream, Laura awoke as from a dream, laughed in the old innocent way, hugged Lizzie but not twice or thrice. Her gleaming locks showed not one thread of grey. Her breath was as sweet as May, and light danced in her eyes. Days, weeks, months, years. Afterwards, when both were wives with children of their own, their mothers' hearts beset with fears, their lives bound up in tender lives, Laura would call the little ones and tell them of her early prime, those pleasant days long gone of not returning time. Would talk about the haunted glen, the wicked, quaint fruit merchant men. Their fruits like honey to the throat, but poison in the blood. Men sell not such in any town. Would tell them how her sister stood in deadly peril to do her good and win the fiery antidote. Then joining hands to little hands would bid them cling together, for there is no friend like a sister in calm or stormy weather, to cheer one on the tedious way, to fetch one if one goes astray, to lift one if one totters down, to strengthen whilst one stands.